Chapter 3. Tinkerbunks looked serious. "If he shows up, I'll give you a shout." "I'd appreciate that," Forrest said. "He's running at Saratoga tomorrow." "Is he now?" Mr. Bunk said. "I wish you luck." They all left the barn. The sky had grown darker. As Forrest drove through the woods, Dink heard thunder. Wind began to whip tree branches back and forth. Forrest drove faster. "I'd better get us home before Josh and Ruth Rose have a shower," he said. Forrest parked behind his barn just as raindrops began to splatter the windshield. "Let's run for it," he said, leaping from the cab. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose ran squealing as the clouds opened up. In seconds, they were soaking wet. Inside the house, Forrest handed them towels. They dried their hair and faces. "Why don't you settle in while I call the police?" he said. "Ruth Rose, you're in the blue bedroom. Guys, you're bunking right across the hall." The kids grabbed their backpacks and headed toward the back of Forrest's house. Ruth Rose stopped outside a bedroom with blue wallpaper. "See you guys in a minute," she said, and disappeared inside. Dink and Josh walked into their room and changed into dry shirts. A minute later, Ruth Rose knocked and came in. Her wet hair was even curlier than usual. "What could have happened to Whirlaway?" she asked Dink and Josh. Dink looked out the bedroom window. Through the rain, he could see the barn, but he couldn't see the barn's rear doors. "You know, someone could have stolen him," Dink said. "Stolen him?" Josh said. In broad daylight?" Dink pointed. "You can't see the back doors of the barn from the house. Anyone could go in and out that way." Ruth Rose peered through the streaming window. "How would you steal a horse?" she asked. "Would you need a trailer? Or the thief could just ride him away," Josh said. "Let's go look behind the barn for clues when the rain stops," Ruth Rose said. "Maybe the police has some good news for Forrest," Dink said. They headed for the kitchen. Forrest was also staring out the window into the rain. His shoulders were hunched, and he was nervously tapping his fingers on the counter. Uncle Warren was sitting at the table drinking a mug of tea. "Did you call the police?" Dink asked. Forrest turned away from the window and nodded. "Yes, they told me no one's called in about a stray horse," he said. "I'm getting worried." "Do you think someone might have stolen him?" Dink asked. Forrest looked at him and blinked a few times. "Stolen Whirlaway? I suppose it's possible." "Forrest, have you any neighbors who own horses?" Uncle Warren asked. "A few. Why?" "Because Whirlaway may not be the only missing horse," Uncle Warren said. "Perhaps you should call around." "Good idea. I will," Forrest said. "We'll help you look for him when the rain stops," Ruth Rose said. Forrest nodded. "That'll be great. Now, I'd better get on the phone," he said as he left the kitchen. The kids drank milk and ate cookies with Uncle Warren. They watched the rain streak down the windows. Forrest came back a few minutes later. "I called 2 friends who own horses," he said. "None are missing, but my friends said they'd keep an eye out for Whirlaway." The rain continued. They played Scrabble. When it wasn't his turn, Forrest kept jumping up to call more neighbors. Finally, the rain stopped and the clouds cleared. When Dink looked out the window, sunlight sparkled off trees and bushes. "I'll go pick up some food for dinner," Uncle Warren said. He took a set of car keys from a hook and left the house. "Okay, kids, let's go look for my horse," Forrest said. He and the kids put on sneakers and headed through the kitchen door to the yard. The wet grass squished under their feet. They walked behind the barn. Forrest headed toward the woods, whistling and yelling, "Whirlaway!" Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose checked the wet ground for tire tracks or footprints. "Nothing," Josh muttered. "Even if there were clues, the rain washed them away." Suddenly, the kids heard a soft whinny from behind the barn. Dink yelled for Forrest, who came running. "Whirlaway?" Forrest said. They all ran into the barn. Standing outside Whirlaway's stall was a wet, muddy horse. "Where have you been, boy?" Forrest asked his horse. Whirlaway shook his head. Water and mud flew off his mane. He stomped his front foot and gazed at the humans. Forrest walked over and grasped Whirlaway's halter. It, too, was muddy. Forrest laughed and shook his head. "Looks like you've been rolling in a big mud puddle," he said. "Kids, do you know how to wash a horse?" "Yes," Josh said. "We wash my pony all the time." Forrest pointed to a hose and some buckets and sponges. He handed Ruth Rose a container of green soap. "Just be careful of his feet," he said. Forrest snapped a leather lead onto Whirlaway's halter, then hooked the other end to a post. "Rinse the mud off first, then soap him down." Just then they heard a phone ringing from the house. "I better get that," Forrest said. "When Whirlaway is dry, just put him back in his stall." He hurried back to the house. Dink filled a bucket with water, then turned the hose on Whirlaway. The horse stood still as muddy water cascaded off his sides. Ruth Rose poured some soap into the bucket, making the water turn green. The suds smelled like freshly cut grass. The kids soaked 3 big sponges in the soapy water. They each began washing a different part of the horse. Whirlaway rolled his eyes and tried to watch all 3 kids. "Hey, look at this," Josh said. He pointed to the horse's side. There was a mark in the mud. It was egg-shaped, about as big as his hand. Inside the oval was some kind of wiggly shape. "Josh, have you been fingerprinting again?" Ruth Rose teased. "I didn't do that," Josh said. "It was already there." The 3 kids looked closely at the imprint. "It almost looks like someone stamped him with something," Josh said.